Okay, so a lot has happened, obviously, since the last time we dropped an episode of US History with Mr. Peterson, presented by Kingdom Lyceum. So I'm in quarantine, and the next few lessons here for US History with Mr. Peterson are they're going to look like this, from my basement. Let's get into today's lesson. All right, so in our last two lessons, we've been focusing on the first and second terms of our first president, President George Washington. We looked at all the different things that he accomplished as president. We looked at all the challenges that he faced as president, whether they were domestic challenges like the Whiskey Rebellion, or foreign challenges like the problems we were having with England on the high seas with impressment, or whether it was the disputes that we had with Spain and other European nations about the boundaries of our new nation. All of these different challenges were what George Washington faced in his first two terms as president. Well, we're in 1795, 1796 now, and another election is coming up. George Washington's second term of 4 years is coming to a close. There were many in the country that wanted George Washington to run again and have a third term as U.S. president. However, today we're going to talk about the most important precedent that George Washington ever set as the first president of the United States. The most important precedent that he set was that he chose voluntarily on his own not to run for a third term. The logic for this decision was lost on a few people, but looking back in history and looking at world history, something that happens outside of this class, we can see how this precedent was very important in shaping the mind and the attitude towards leadership here in our new country. George Washington was by far the most popular person in America. Very few people had something bad to say about Washington, and even the people who did have something bad to say about George Washington respected him like crazy. George Washington could have ran for a third term, probably a fourth term, if he lived long enough, probably a fifth term, and he would have won in a landslide probably every time. However, George Washington decides, I'm going to step away because the government that was structured in the Constitutional Convention was specifically designed to prevent one person or one group or one branch from becoming too powerful. George Washington felt that it was important to set this precedent to keep the power out of the hands of one man here in the U.S. government. So after 8 years in office, he voluntarily decides not to run for a third term. This decision was outlined in something that's called in history, and something that was called at the time, as George Washington's farewell address. And this was an essay that he wrote himself, and he had it published in newspapers all throughout the country, explaining why their beloved president was not going to seek re-election. It was not a long essay, and in it he very eloquently stated his reasons, and he also gave the American people 3 distinct warnings for the future of American government and the future of our American nation. Here are those 3. The first warning that George Washington gives us in his farewell address was to beware of disputes that would lead us to form factions or to form political parties. You might recognize that term faction. It comes from one of the Federalist Papers. And at this time, there was lots of factions and political parties that were starting to emerge here in the United States. George Washington realized that that was something that could be very detrimental to our democratic and Republican processes. And so he warns people against viewing America and viewing our government through the eyes of a specific faction or a specific political party. That was warning number 1. And the second thing that George Washington cautioned the American government to avoid would be entangling alliances with European nations. He wanted America to take some time away from Europe. Obviously, we would still have our representatives over there. We would still have our ambassadors, but we need to not get involved and mind our own business and focus on the building of our new country and not get involved and drawn into any wars that were taking place on a continent across the ocean. Because, I mean, if you remember, that's what happened to England when they were fighting their war against us, and how did it work out for them? Yeah. George Washington said, let's not be on the other side of that. Let's stay away from any alliances that would cause us to become involved in things that we have no business being involved with. And the third, and probably most practical, even on a personal level, that George Washington encouraged the American government in his farewell address was to stay out of debt. For real, y'all. Like, stay out of debt. You know? It's credit cards, dangerous. College, just kidding. No, you should go to college, but find one that you can afford. No, or don't go to college. Like, find a career path that makes you happy, makes money that you're good at. Is that some life advice from Mr. Peterson, but ultimately from George Washington, the first American president? Are you not going to listen to George Washington? That wouldn't be a good idea. So the farewell address cements the fact that George Washington will not be the president. So Americans have to come to grips with this very quickly because a new election is coming just around the corner. That was the election of 1796, and this was a different one because in the first election, President Washington was running again, and he was going to win. Like, it was a foregone conclusion. This one, though, it was up for grabs. Who actually could win this election? And this is where you start to see the emergence of early political parties here in America. Dang it, America, like George Washington just said. Did you not hear him? him. Stay away from the political parties. But it's too late. Those political parties were already forming, even during the time before George Washington as president. He recognized that and he saw it. He just warned us against getting too involved with them. But these two political parties, we already know. They're the Democratic Republicans that align themselves with the ideas of men like Thomas Jefferson. And then there were the Federalists. And the Federalists had been around for a while. They were pro-large central government. They were pro-industrialization. They were men like Alexander Hamilton. These guys were our Federalists. And now both these parties have to make a presidential nomination. Elections were a little different back then. You didn't do like you do today where you have your president and your vice president. Everybody just ran for president. And the person who got the most votes got to be the president. And then the person who got the second most got to be the vice president, which, as you can probably imagine, would be a little weird eventually, and it happened in this election. The Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, whatever you want to call them, they chose a no-brainer. They wanted Thomas Jefferson as the guy to run and represent the Republicans here in the election of 1796. Then another guy who was also a Democratic Republican, Aaron Burr, decided that he was also going to run for president. He knew he couldn't beat Jefferson, but he was hoping to get that vice president slot. Then you would have a Republican president and a Republican vice president. What could go wrong? Well, what could go wrong was the fact that the Federalists nominated George Washington's current vice president, John Adams. Many of them wanted Thomas Pinckney because, hey, you can't go wrong with the dude who signed the Pinckney Treaty, but, you know, he obviously didn't get selected to run for the presidency, so that was the end of that there. So John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr are all running for president. John Adams is associated with George Washington's home run administration. Thomas Jefferson is beloved by many of the people living in the frontier, the people who don't live in the large towns. Like, they love Thomas Jefferson. Aaron Burr is like another solid shot. Everybody knows he's not really going to win, but, you know, he's in there. And so the Republicans are trying to get a Republican administration. However, they don't even get that because John Adams wins the election of 1796. George Washington's vice president is now going to become the next president of the United States. And here's the problem for old John Adams. You're following a legend, man. It's not going to go well for you. I'm sorry. Like, they're just going to compare you to him. So yeah, that's what happens. Adams wins the presidency. Jefferson wins the vice presidency. Aaron Burr is left out in the cold. He would obviously be influential in other ways, but now we have a Federalist president and then a Democratic Republican for vice president. Obviously, this was an awkward situation for both of them. However, this was how our government set it up back then. So you had a somewhat disunified second presidential administration with John Adams as the president and then Thomas Jefferson as the vice president. However, another precedent that was set by George Washington that we talked about in our other videos was the idea of ideological diversity. So it wouldn't be the worst thing if these two guys were trying to run a country together. Adams was incredibly qualified to be the president of the United States. Like, he was at the forefront during the Constitutional Convention. He was a major player in the government of George Washington as the vice president. He saw how this government was operating. He knew the good things that were going on. He knew the bad things that were happening. However, John Adams, like we said, was always going to be living in the shadow of his former president, President George Washington. And for that reason, lots of the things that he did just weren't good enough to the American public. So 2 years into retirement, after serving his country as the first president and arguably the most successful president, George Washington dies from complications from medical treatment at the age of 66 years old. They gave him leeches to suck out the bad blood, which we know nowadays is not a good idea. He dies on December 14th, 1799. The nation goes into mourning. They're upset that their first and most famous leader had passed away. George Washington is one of the most honored presidents in American history. Obviously, the state of Washington is named after him. He is on our money. As it was said of him, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, George Washington would be sorely missed. I mean, it's been 220 years since he died, and I feel a debt of gratitude to George Washington. I'm thankful that God put a man like him in position to be the president of the United States, to lead us through all the different struggles in the War for Independence, in the Articles of Confederation, during the Constitutional Convention, and then finally serving our country. We don't want to do too much great man history here on this program, but man, George Washington was a man for the ages, and God saw fit to allow him to be our president, and Americans today are still impacted by George Washington. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the man who lived in Washington's shadow, the presidency of John Adams. We'll check you then. All right, we'll see what the next lesson looks like. Maybe we'll find a different angle of the basement to film from. Either way, like and subscribe.